Hi, friends. Hope you're well. I wanted to just jump on briefly and share some thoughts. Actually, I'd like to share some little parts of my own history and some particular seasons in life that I think my own reflection on them and how they've worked out over time might actually end up being encouraging and helpful to some of you. I know that many find discipleship challenging enough already. And sometimes when you begin to reorient the gospel around, like we say on the Apocalyptic Gospel podcast, the way a first century Jew would have understood the gospel, sometimes it takes some reorientation for your faith and for your practical discipleship. So I want to give you some helpful tools that were helpful for me as a younger disciple. I remember years ago, my life as a disciple was probably not uncommon. It was sincere and yet erratic. It had highs and lows, big highs and big lows. And some of the issues here are that I didn't understand how to navigate my life. And that's kind of the evidence of an immature disciple. And so it's normal. I was growing as a disciple in progress. And but I remember a number of these seasons where I'd been through a really dry time and really hoping to have a different season emerge. And so something would happen, or I would have a real something would happen, and I would kind of get this sense that maybe this season of dryness is ending. And it was very encouraging, and I was glad to kind of be coming out of the season where I was in, only to find out a few weeks later, 3-4 weeks later, that kind of I was just back in the same spot again. And I went, oh, well, I guess it wasn't what I was hoping it would be. And it wasn't until many years later that I realized that I was misunderstanding what was going on in life and with the Lord and with me, with myself and my own life. And so I wanted to share a little bit of that and how that ended up breaking down and how it kind of breaks down theologically and even doctrinally, or I shouldn't say doctrinally, let's say theologically, and even how we read the Bible sometimes. And so the first thing that this involves is a word that we often think of in a different context. It's the word grace. And we often think of the word grace as, well, in some contexts, it's a divine force that God exerts to overcome the objections of human free will. That's God's grace in some contexts. In other contexts, God's grace is a favorable look on humanity that God has. God has generally looked on humanity with kindness, which is true. And this is his grace, also true. But there's a little bit more to it. And so I want to first start by touching on the fact that grace, interesting to note that the word grace doesn't actually, in Greek it's the word charis, or charis, but charis. And that word doesn't actually appear on the lips of Jesus in the Gospels. Jesus never says the word charis. Now it's said of Jesus, and it says that he gave us charis in the Gospels, but Jesus never uses the word. Isn't that interesting? In none of the gospel accounts, none of the letters in red, in other words. And but what you have in Paul, obviously, is Paul uses it frequently. It's all over the place in his diaspora letters to the groups out in the diaspora. And there's a reason for that. It's because grace, that word charis, actually was evoking a well-known social dynamic in the Roman world. And I didn't know this for a long time. But looking back, it really helps me understand those seasons. And let me explain. That might seem a little bit of a stretch, but let me clarify. So in the Greco-Roman world, culture really functioned like all cultures on the basis of relationships. And in modern culture, we might have relationships with an individual, and likewise we might have relationships with an institution. Like one example is we might have a relationship. I remember several years ago, 20 years ago or so, I bought a vehicle and I needed to take out a loan on the vehicle. So I entered into a relationship with an institution, with a credit union, and I took out a loan for a certain number of years, and then I paid off the loan, and then our relationship ended. Well, the ancient world was no less than this, governed by a lot of different kinds of relationships. And one of the crucial, and I say one of the crucial relationships that defined this world is sometimes known as the patron-client relationship. And the patron-client relationship is almost like the ancient version of us just going to a bank. So prior to the modern form of a bank, a lot of things happened in the ancient world through patrons, through wealthy or powerful men or families who would administrate whatever their wealth was in a way that was a benefit to others, and that was at the same time an indirect benefit to themselves or to the family. So I'll explain that, because that's what a bank does, right? You don't go to a bank and just, tell them you're a really nice guy. They have interest, and you don't, and because they have certain interests involved, they're going to charge you with interest, right? They have something in it for themselves. And interestingly, this relationship worked the same way. There's a I say well known. Seems to be prominent. We've recovered a number of his works. There was an old Roman philosopher, Greco-Roman philosopher named Seneca. And he wrote frequently on this subject of Cadiz, which is really interesting if you're a student of the New Testament, that he wrote how crucial the subject of Cadiz is to not to the New Testament, to the Greco-Roman culture. And he said, because Cadiz, and he basically defined, I'm going to summarize these, but he basically defined Cadiz as three things. It was three elements that basically forged together a relationship between two people. And the first one was, and this is what we might be more familiar with when we read the Bible. The first one was when a patron or the wealthy person, the powerful person, looked with favor or kindness on the person who was requesting help. That sense of a favorable disposition, that was known as Cadiz. And that is easy to match up in the Bible when we think of how God has had Cadiz on us. Like he's looked favorably on humankind and he sent his son, right? And so that's an easy one to see. Secondly, says Seneca, Cadiz is also what happens in response to that favor, that favorable disposition, that the wealthy person, the patron, would give a gift in response. That gift is also called a Cadiz. It's a gift given in response to that favorable disposition that he had. Both are known as Cadiz in the ancient Greco-Roman world. And thirdly, and no less important than the other two for upholding ancient Greco-Roman civilization or cultural standards, was that it was also called Cadiz when you returned as the recipient of Cadiz, recipient of grace, when you returned grace back to the patron. Now, of course, we're not saying that they could pay back the money that was given to them or the great favor that was given to them, but there was an appropriate response by the recipient back to the patron. And so these three dynamics, actually, says Seneca, they defined a well-functioning Greco-Roman culture. And that if either of these three were to collapse, you would have the collapse of culture as they knew it. So these are interesting. You may be making some of the connections already. But number one, it's easy to see how God being the patron and us being the recipient, right? And the first one I think is easier to understand in terms of the Bible. Another one that's easy to see would be is like how this could be seen as a gift, right? If this is seen as a gift in response to grace, then that makes sense as well. So, for example, God looking favorably at someone requesting a favor or requesting grace. There's an interesting dynamic here that's at play that we also might not be aware of just by reading Paul's letters, is that you might think of like the bank relationship that I gave at the beginning that has a term to it. After I've paid off my loan, our relationship is ended. I've actually not walked in to that bank for 15 years because my relationship ended with them. But that wasn't the expectation of these old relationships. These relationships were expected to continue on. They would be perpetual. In other words, once you had received grace, it was expected that you would behave in such a way and respond in such a way that you would be a great candidate for the patron to continue pouring grace into. And I think that is really assumed in a lot of the New Testament. And this is one of the elements that I did not understand. When we understand God's gift of grace, whether it's, turning our hearts away from wickedness, or it's a grace to have wisdom and understanding, or if it's a grace to have perseverance in hard times, when we understand those things as being static, it definitely can actually have a really negative effect in the long term. Because when you see receiving those things as a static event, oh, God just gave me grace, He gave me wisdom, gave me perseverance, He gave me this, and then you fail to steward that grace in a way that is conducive to a life of appropriate response to grace, then according to this old relationship in the Greco-Roman world, you would not be a good candidate to receive future grace anymore. In other words, next time you go back, you wouldn't be a good candidate to receive future grace. So so the patron might say, I don't want to give this person grace, because there were occasions described by Seneca. What if the recipient receives grace and then he goes out and he acts scandalously with the gift? And he acts in a way that's disgraceful to others and is dishonorable. What that will do is people will begin to talk. Did you hear that patron funded this guy's way of life in dishonorable conduct? And then it reflects dishonorably on him, and he says, well, I don't want to be associated with that. And so the favorable response was essentially thought of as gratitude, and then an honorable way of life, and a way of life that honored the patron, both that honored his gift to you and that was honoring to him. When people hear that he's given you a gift, it seems like he was a really smart guy for funding you. So, for example, 1 Peter 2, beginning in verse 18, slaves, accept the authority of your masters with all deference, not only with those who are kind and gentle, but also those who are harsh. For it is a credit to you, a credit, if being aware of God, so being conscious of God, you endure pain while you suffer unjustly. If you endure when you are beaten for doing wrong, what credit is that? But if you endure when you do what is right and you suffer for it, you have God's approval. So you'll notice there's no mention of grace. It's because of translators, because it's a little bit awkward to say this, but literally what's being said in these passages is he says, it is a credit to you. It says it will gain or earn grace for you. And then after that, he says, what credit is it if you endure punishment for doing what's wrong? But if you do what's right and you still endure for it, it will, again, uses the word charis, again, second time. It will gain or earn charis with God. So God sees these things and God says, I want to give this person more grace. In other words, there is a very dynamic relationship involved with the receiving of grace from God. And it's assumed throughout the New Testament. Hebrews 4, well-known passage where it talks about making sure that we know that we can approach God and his throne of grace to receive grace in our time of need. And later on in chapter 10, I think it is, he says, make sure no one falls short of the grace of God. And I think chapter 13 is going to say it's a good thing for the heart to be strengthened with grace. So these things are assumed that this was in place and that people were functioning according to these things. But what about the third kind? What about the third way of explaining grace? And the third way is also actually there in the text of the Bible. So it's not as frequently, but you can find it a number of times. The reason you don't recognize it is because it's often translated gratitude. So Hebrews 12, verse 28 says this, therefore, since we are receiving a kingdom that cannot be shaken, let us give thanks, by which we offer to God an acceptable worship with reverence and fear, for God is a consuming fire. Again, where's grace in here? It's in the word, let us offer to God thanks. Let us give him thanks. That word thanks is the word charis. It's the word translated grace throughout the New Testament. Again, this is the last part of that cycle of grace. Grace is meant, the receiving of grace on our part is intended to initiate a cycle or a relationship where there's a constant flow of grace from the great patron, from God to us, and us back to God through gratitude and living lives that are worthy of his name and worthy of his gift. And so one of the things that I failed to understand as a young man was that it's good to understand God's gift that he gives, God's grace, as a stewardship or almost like a seed. You want to care for it. You don't want to squander it. You don't want to take it and go, oh, great, I have this gift from God, and then I'm just going to go and play video games and, whatever, waste my life. That would be to squander and, God forbid, even deem yourself unworthy of receiving grace from God in the future. So how does this play out? And I'll tell you how it played out for me, is I realized I need to stop squandering the gift that God's giving me. He's giving me this little spiritual awakening. I can't go back to this way of life I was in because that way of life was cycling, right? I wasn't living in sin. I was just living for now. I was just living to pass the time, living for entertainment. But I was spiraling. I was not living in a way that I don't think I was a worthy recipient of future grace for God. I was just squandering every time he did something kind for me. It's like James says in context to the conversation of grace, because he says God gives grace to the humble, but he resists the proud. And just before that, what he says is you have not because you don't ask, or because you ask and then you just ask to spend it on your own pleasures. And so he's saying we can spend God's gifts in a way that makes us ineligible to receive future grace from God. And so what I realized is I want to take whatever grace God gives now, and I want to steward every bit of that to live my life in a way that is conducive to coming before God and going, God, I am dry. I really need an awakening, a spiritual awakening inside again. God, I need wisdom and discernment. God, I need to understand the scriptures. God, I need to look at the world with discernment again instead of looking around and being baffled at the world like the rest of the world is. God, please help and give me wisdom. I want to feel confident that God goes, I love answering his prayers. I love looking at that humble young man, and when he asks of me, I love responding with grace and pouring out my grace with him liberally. And so the context is that a willingness by God is maintained by a relationship. And I think that we would all agree with that. Only we've thought of the relationship in terms that we're a little too static, I think. And I think that this understanding of how grace works, not just in the Greco-Roman world, but how Paul is trying to evoke that relationship so that we would understand how that works with us. So what I'm going to suggest is whatever grace God has given you right now, whatever sense of spiritual fervor, whatever a grace to pray, to study the scriptures God's given you, don't take it for granted. Give yourselves to the scriptures. Give yourselves to a life of prayer, to a life of making him known, making known what he's done for you and what he's done for the world and what he's going to do for the world in the future. Make those things known for others, because it actually makes you conducive to receiving future grace from God. And it actually creates a cycle of grace filling your life, and gratitude and praise and honor being returned back to God. And then continue infinitely. So my hope is that we could take some of the things that we've been talking about over the last several years with the podcast and even those who followed before that, and apply it to a lifestyle of taking the gift that God gives, whether it's money or it's a spirit of wisdom, a real grace to have discernment, or whether it's endurance, that your faith is strong during difficulties. And you don't take that for granted, that you take that and you steward your relationship with the Almighty in a way that gives you confidence to come before God, to his throne of grace, to ask for grace in your time of need, so that he would constantly fill us as disciples with the grace that we need to continue on the crazy path that the world is on right now. And that we might invite other disciples to this same journey and the same relationship of coming before their Father to receive grace for their time of need and to continue to grow as disciples themselves. So this has been way longer than I anticipated, but I hope that this is helpful. And I might do a follow-up video to this, so keep an eye out for that. But I hope this is helpful. As always, leave questions or comments in wherever you see the video, and I'll do my best to get back with them as I can. Thanks, guys. Appreciate you bearing with me for 22 minutes of this little monologue here. But the Lord be with you all. Shalom.